This episode of Conjuncture was recorded in Detroit in March 2025 and produced with support of the Trinity Social Justice Institute and the Antipode Foundation.
Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm really delighted to be here today with Camilla Hawthorne. Camilla is a critical geographer who teaches sociology and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is the author of Contesting Race and Citizenship, Youth Politics in the Black Mediterranean. She's the co-editor of the Black Geographic and the co-editor of the Black Mediterranean. I'm thrilled to have the chance to speak with Camilla today about the stakes in how we theorize racisms, xenophobic nationalisms, and the fascism of our time. So thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Camilla. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm really grateful for our intellectual comradeship that we've developed over the years. And it's always great to be in dialogue.
The pleasure is truly mine. So I wanted to start with this new essay that you're working on and that you presented a portion of in this new Directions and Gramscian Studies panels that we were part of this week at the AAG, the American Association of Geographers, here in Detroit. And the title of this essay, A Common History and a Common Disaster, Du Boisian Diasporic Politics in the Black Mediterranean, is forthcoming in a volume that Yusuf Al-Baluchi and other colleagues are editing. And in it, you argue that we should read W.E.B. Du Bois in relationship to political formations in the Black Mediterranean in order to gain a new insight about how we might resist the racist, capitalist nationalisms of our time. But in that talk and in the essay, you argue for a relational theorizations of racisms and of fascisms to show the links between these far-right movements in Southern Europe and North America and beyond. So I just wanted to begin by inviting you to say what you're doing in that essay and why does it matter to have a relational theorization?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start by saying that the title of that essay comes from a chapter in Du Bois's Dusk of Dawn. So, I'm both reading Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, but also reading it in relationship to Dusk of Dawn, and specifically his chapter on the concept of race, where he's really kind of trying to work through how we both understand Blackness as a category around which we feel affective and political ties, but also when race is this sort of constantly shifting, or what Stuart Hall would say, a kind of floating signifier. And he comes to this understanding of Blackness as a set of shared social heritage rather than a biological heritage. And that's a shared social heritage that then links sort of all dispossessed and colonized people around the world because of what he calls a common history and a common disaster, in a way that, really signals a kind of third worldist orientation to solidarity politics. So in this paper, like you said, I'm thinking about a relational theorization of racisms. And of course, I get relational theorization from Jill Hart's really germinal essay, Denaturalizing Dispossession, which appeared in Antipode. And Jill talks about relational comparison as distinct from a bounded comparison, right? She says, instead of thinking about phenomena, objects, movements as these kind of self-contained categories that we can compare and contrast, she says a relational comparison actually thinks about the ways that they are mutually constituted in the multiple arenas of politics and everyday life. And so my interest in really trying to use those insights from Jill Hart to think about the global politics of racism emerged from my engagement with debates about the politics of race in Italy, and particularly scholarship about race in Italy. So, I really started doing work on race and Blackness and migration in Italy, as early as 2009 when I was an undergrad, but I started my PhD in 2012. And when I first started going to Italy and, telling other scholars that I was really interested in studying the politics of racism and race in Italy, I was met with shock and horror, particularly from white scholars who would say things like, we don't say razza, or the Italian word for race, we don't say race because One, it is just a fascist holdover, and two, we know that races don't biologically exist. And then they would go on to say things like, you Americans are so obsessed with race, and really the problem is class, as though these things are mutually exclusive. for those few scholars who at that time were really trying to think in a critical way about racism as this structuring sociopolitical force, they were often constrained to use the English word race in scare quotes, right? They couldn't even use the Italian word. It was still very tenuous. Now, a lot has really opened up in, the intervening 10 years. There's a lot of really important critical work across the disciplines about race as this really central category through which we understand the history of the concept of Italianness, linking it to histories of Italian national unification, Italian colonialism, fascism, and the kind of the xenophobic backlashes that came with Italy's transformation to a country of immigration. But what I've started to notice is that there's a kind of a second impasse now, which is that we have this really sophisticated language for thinking through the specificities of race, like how do we understand the specificities of racial formation in Italy in relation to Southern Europe's kind of marginalization in relation to Northern Europe, Italy, and sort of histories of Mediterraneanist racial thinking and fascism, colonialism, and so on. But it's very easy to fall into a kind of trap of Italian exceptionalism, right? Where people can then say, well, it's not as bad here, right? Racism is more extreme in the United States, but in Italy it's different because we are a poorer country or a country of immigration, or our colonialism was weak and ineffectual, or our fascism wasn't really racial, or it didn't get racial until Mussolini, was really learning from Hitler. At the same time, there is still like a need for a grounded specificity, right? Like that's what I was trained. That's how I was trained to think as a geographer. And I also learned a lot from Black Italian activists who were really trying to come up with a language and set of strategies that could really address the specificities of anti-Black racism in Italy and all the ways that it might differ from the United States. And so eventually, in going back to reading the work of Jill Hart and many other people, I came to really understand that the problem was methodological nationalism, ultimately. Like that's what the hurdle was. It's that we sort of talk about racial regimes in different countries as these self-contained units where we end up with, we'll compare and contrast anti-Black racism in Italy and the United States, which leads to, I think, wholly uninteresting and unproductive questions like, which country is more racist? Which country is worse for Black people, right? It's not a particularly interesting line of questioning. And I also started to think more about these traces that I had noticed over the years of doing my research that actually showed that there were these histories of connections between the US and Italy in terms of racial politics, ideas of difference, strategies of resistance. So in the paper, I kind of try to trace some of these different connections. For example, the Southernist, what Gramsci called the Southernists, right? Those homegrown Italian racial theorists who were trying to understand the supposed racial alterity of Southern Italians, their ideas circulated to the United States and then were cited by immigration restrictionists in the United States, whose advocacy led to immigration laws in 1921 and 1924 that essentially curtailed all Italian immigration to the United States. And Cesare Lombroso, who is, Italy's foremost racial theorist and is also considered the father of modern criminology, was looking at sort of developments in carceral technologies in the United States. So he actually had a scale model of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, considered like the world's first modern penitentiary, reproduced for his own criminological museum. So in the essay, I start by, again, inspired by Jill Hart, right? I owe this essay to Jill Hart, who really encouraged me to do this, to say, what happens if we actually think about the fact that Reconstruction after the Civil War was happening at the same time as Italian national unification, right? These were both happening during the same moment at the end of the 19th century. And in both cases, right, there are these really important discussions that are happening about North-South relations, about the relationship between industrial labor and agricultural labor, about citizenship rights for subjugated and exploited groups. And again, there's a cross-referencing as well, because advocates of Italian national unification were often looking to the United States and saying, we Italians are subjugated just like enslaved Black people, right? Which, I mean, the extent to which that comparison is accurate, we could debate, and I would say it's probably not, right? But there is this kind of cross-referencing that's happening. And so from there, I start to think about what happens if we actually put Du Bois's writings on Reconstruction and Antonio Gramsci's writings on the Southern question into dialogue with each other. What can we actually learn from the way that they are thinking about spatiality, again, about North-South relations, but also about the ways that racial ideologies, notions of difference get used to subvert what could be truly transgressive cross-racial class solidarities, right, that challenge the capitalist class. And so I think this really matters right now because there is so much kind of exceptionalizing that comes about when we're thinking about this kind of neo-fascist resurgence in this moment. Even at our panel yesterday, someone in the audience said, you know, I have all these friends who know that I study Italy and are saying, oh, well, you know, I got to escape Trump and go to Italy, right? I hear that a lot as someone who also has an EU passport, Italian citizenship. If we're escaping Trump, but what about Giorgia Meloni in Italy? And of course, it's not a coincidence that we have Trump in the United States and Meloni in Italy. And so again, this is why we need conjunctural analysis, right? We really need to understand what is it about this moment that has given us this resurgence of neo-fascist, far-right, xenophobic nationalisms, and why are they so deeply networked? How are the ways that they are learning from each other, sharing strategies across borders, using similar kinds of languages?
Yeah, thanks for this. It's really important. And I wanted to ask a question that's related about Giorgia Meloni, because, you know, some of our viewers and listeners may have noticed that she was invited to Trump's second inauguration, along with Javier Milei, another far-right figure from Argentina. Who's Meloni? What's the Brothers of Italy about? And why do you characterize them as a neo-fascist formation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've certainly gotten into arguments with members of my own family in Italy and with scholars about whether or not it's accurate to call the current Prime Minister of Italy a fascist, and I would argue pretty vehemently that she is. And it's one of the things about Meloni that's important to remember is, you know, not only the Brothers of Italy party, but the party that she was trained in, the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the MSI, was the party that was formed by former fascist officials after the abolition of the fascist party in Italy, right? So the fascist party was abolished after World War II, after the overthrow of Mussolini, and many of these fascists simply reconstituted themselves into a new party. And Giorgia Meloni was basically a student activist. She sort of got her political training in the MSI, right? So she really has these very clear sorts of connections to, let's say, the afterlives, the kind of zombified afterlives of Italian fascism. I think what's really important to note is that there is a tendency to kind of exceptionalize fascism, right? To say, if we're talking about fascism, we're only talking about like a specific historical, geographical moment, these particular governments during these time periods. But if we look to insights from Black European studies, from anti-colonial theory, right? I'm thinking about people like Amy Césaire, for instance, we start to see that fascism can only be exceptionalized in this way if we are bounding Europe from its colonial peripheries. Once we start to think, again, relationally about the metropole and colony relationship, then we see that fascism in Europe was the perfection of a set of technologies and strategies and politics that were used in the colonies and then imported and carried out against populations inside Europe. And when we do that, it really opens up, I think, a more broader conceptualization of how we think about fascist politics, their relation to, racial ideology, to colonialism, to imperialism, right? So like we can't think about the Holocaust, for example, without also thinking about the Herero and Nama genocide, right? Also committed by the Germans before the Holocaust, right? The training grounds, in a sense. Or in Italy, a lot of people forget, racial laws were enacted in the colonies before they were enacted within the Italian peninsula itself, right? And so if anything, I think this exceptionalizing of fascism as this very sort of contained, bounded political moment what it does is it sort of allows us to keep alive a certain benevolent myth of like Western universalism and humanitarianism, right? That was restored after the end of World War II. I think this also matters because when we start to think in this kind of more like globally capacious sense about fascism, we also then have to really take seriously the continuities between liberalism and fascism, which I am not seeing enough about in this moment, right? I'm not seeing enough kind of mainstream analysis of that continuity, right? What happens if we actually say that this isn't a moment of rupture from what came before? So again, Italy, where I do my work, fascism gets bracketed, right? It's this specific time period, and specifically late fascism, right? Like Italy in the 40s gets bracketed. Like that's when fascism got bad. That's when fascism got racial. That's when Mussolini was too influenced by Hitler and Nazi Germany. But if we read Gramsci really closely, right, we see that the conditions of possibility for fascism were really forged in the process of Italian national unification during the liberal period, which was also unfolding at the same time as Italian overseas colonialism, right? These very intertwined processes. What happened, particularly in Europe, is that after World War II, there was this really powerful kind of silencing of race, of histories of fascism, of histories of colonialism, right? So that we ended up with, for example, the UNESCO statements on race, right, which were seen as a kind of response to fascist policies of eugenics, where basically the prescription was, we're not going to talk about race anymore. We saw that race led to all of these horrible things, so we're not going to talk about it. We have overcome the problem of difference, and now we can sort of return to our Western liberal humanitarian values. But you know, there's this brilliant anthropologist named Camilla Hawthorne, and she makes this really important argument that this kind of post-World War II liberal anti-racism, it left untouched racism as the underlying condition of possibility for the ongoing production of race, right? So we've removed the word race, but we haven't actually addressed the conditions under which this thing called race is constantly being produced in the world. And as we know, racism didn't go away. It like very obviously did not go away, but it was kind of buried, right? This is where we get scholars like David Theo Goldberg who talk about racial evaporations, right? Racism didn't go away after World War II, but it started to take on these kind of more subtle forms. And I think one of the challenges in this moment is that as scholars, we've developed these really, what I'm thinking of is like basically tools that are like flea combs, right? These very, very finely grained tools for being able to diagnose the subtle ways that racism has been reproduced in this moment, right? So that's where we get stuff like colorblind racism or new racism, cultural fundamentalism, differential racism, racism without racists, right? All of these terms. But now that this like very explicit, like full-throated, often like biological racism has kind of come roaring back, how do we diagnose that? And how do we understand the relationship between those two things? Because again, it's very frequently thought of as a rupture, right? We defeated fascism, right? We solved the problem of racism. Oh no, it's back again. How do we make that conceptual leap? And again, I think part of it is really about having the tools to trace the continuities between liberalism and fascism, to understand how this post-World War II moment actually kind of laid the conditions of possibility for this resurgence. And so, you know, again, to your question of like, who is Meloni? Why would I call her fascist? We can think about continuities in these sorts of tactics. I know I told you about the award that my grandmother won. So my Italian grandmother received this framed award from the fascist government in Italy around 1941 for having lots of children for Italy, right, as part of a fascist pronatalist politics. And there's an inscription on the poster that says, "The future of nations is tied to their demographic potential." Okay? Like a very explicit project of positive eugenics. And we're now seeing the same thing happening both in Italy and in the US and everywhere else where fascism is rearing its head again in attacks on reproductive autonomy, fears of ethnic replacement, right? The demonization of so-called anchor babies. We're seeing this in appeals to hypermasculinity through militarism. We're seeing this in the aestheticization of violence in this moment. Romantic appeals to a kind of pure and uncorrupted past, right? These are all things that come from this fascist playbook. All tactics to basically sublimate the disaffections of the working classes that have been really screwed over by capitalist dispossession, and to also disrupt the kinds of radical transgressive solidarities that both Du Bois and Gramsci were really hoping for.
That's fantastic. So, I mean, there's a kind of double move with relational theorization then. It enables a break with methodological nationalism, but also a relational reading of Du Bois and Gramsci together as two theorists of racism and of fascism. And that's something that, you know, that relational approach to reading theory is something you also do in this book. I waved at our viewers and listeners, Contesting Race and Citizenship, which I will do again. And in that book, you offer a really significant intervention, just building on what you're explaining now, about why we need to understand Italy as a central node in a global far-right network where this resurgent white supremacist, nationalist, misogynist, anti-immigrant far-right has taken shape. And you mobilize Gramsci this time, though, in relationship to Stuart Hall, to theorize the geography of fascism in relationship to what, following Hall, you describe as racisms in the plural. So I wanted to ask you to reflect a bit on the centrality of this anti-immigrant common sense and project to the far right's hegemony in Italy, and also what can be learned by these struggles for citizenship and youth politics in Italy for confronting the right.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for kind of drawing out the Gramsci-Hall connection, which is one that is really deeply meaningful to me, you know, as a Black Italian, as a Black European, particularly early on in my trajectory when I was, again, trying to think about how to theorize race in Italy at a time when I was being told by so many scholars that it wasn't, that there was no there, right? And the way that Stuart Hall is reading Gramsci and sort of Gramsci's emphasis on historical and geographical specificity as a way to say that, right, there is no racism in general, but these historically and geographically situated racisms really gave me a language, again, to break out of this methodological nationalism, these bounded comparisons, or even a kind of ideal type analysis in which racism maps onto a kind of particular North American centric racial structure that actually does not quite map onto the, not to say that racial hierarchies in the US are somehow neat and uncomplicated, but a very specific kind of messiness that is characteristic of Italy's relationship to the Mediterranean, and this, you know, this kind of position as not quite Europe and not quite Africa, and the way that that has been interpreted by racial theorists for a very long time and has been central in debates over Italianness. Stuart Hall is really who enabled me to be able to do that. So in contesting race and citizenship, you know, I started by really trying to understand a new kind of political movement that I saw emerging that was being led in large part, although not exclusively, by the Italian-born and raised children of immigrants from Africa and Latin America, around a shared sense of subjectivity as being Black in Italy, and all the ways that that seemed to be really differing from earlier moments when we saw people organizing around a kind of shared sense of being migrant workers, or even organizing as, you know, Nigerians in Italy, Eritreans in Italy. But there was increasingly these conversations of, you know, people saying, oh, we are Afro-Italians, or we are Black Italians, and all sorts of fascinating debates about terminology. But there was something about a kind of shared experience of subjectivation as Black in Italy that was becoming a kind of a site from which certain kinds of struggles could be organized. The truth is that I didn't actually intend to write a book about citizenship. I think because my sort of leftist politics and sort of political education had taught me to be very skeptical of nation-state citizenship for all of the ways that it is exclusionary. And yet, one of the really wonderful and delightful things about ethnography is that you go in with a particular set of ideas about the questions you want to ask, and then people sort of move you to rethink your questions and to rethink your research. And I kept finding that when I would sit down and talk to people about their experiences of being Black in Italy, the question of citizenship was really central. Italy's citizenship laws are based on blood descent and not birthplace, and they're among the most restrictive in Europe. So even if you were born in Italy, if your parents were immigrants, you're not automatically a citizen at birth. It's a very long and labyrinthine and complicated process where you get basically a one-year window between your 18th and 19th birthdays when you can apply for Italian citizenship if you meet a very, very long list of criteria. And even if you meet those criteria, we've all heard the jokes about Italian bureaucracy, you might be left waiting for years and years and years without updates about your status. And this has really massive consequences, both kind of emotionally, affectively, psychologically, but also in terms of people's ability to pursue career paths, in terms of people's ability to move across borders freely. And I kind of came to understand through these conversations and through my own involvement in the citizenship reform movement in Italy that I think the left hasn't always taken the politics of nation-state citizenship very seriously, because we, I think rightfully so, understand citizenship as an apparatus of exclusion or differential inclusion as a tool for kind of filtering and differentiating a racialized labor force. But the response, which is a kind of, attempts to rescale citizenship either up or down, right? To say nation-state citizenship is exclusionary. So we're going to think about urban citizenship, informal citizenship, citizenship from below, or global citizenship, or cosmopolitan citizenship, which are all really beautiful ideas. But in doing so, I think there's been almost a kind of naive neglect of the kind of hegemony that the nation-state system has over citizenship as a way of conferring rights and access to mobility and all sorts of things. And so as a result, it's been almost unexamined as a site of struggle because it is this sort of difficult contradiction to deal with, right? Like, we don't want it, but it matters. Mm-hmm. And as I kind of came to understand in doing the research, citizenship was one of the places where race was kind of buried after World War II, right? Where ideas about citizenship and all of the ways that we define insiders and outsiders become places where sort of ideas of racial difference get coded, right? They get encoded within the apparatus of citizenship. And again, now in this moment of a kind of neo-fascist resurgence, we're seeing very explicitly the ways that these efforts to rebound nations are exhuming these long buried links between nation, state, citizenship. We're seeing this happen in the deportations of undocumented immigrants. We're seeing this in attempts to reinterpret the 14th Amendment to revoke birthright citizenship. We're seeing this in the disappearing of visa holders for their pro-Palestine activism on US campuses, right? Like, these are all sort of questions of how we understand citizenship as this site of struggle, and citizenship where debates about sort of race and belonging are being played out in this moment. And I say this not to defend nation-state citizenship at all, right? But just to say that I think it is this really deeply consequential, but unfortunately really overlooked site of struggle in this moment. I always return to a question that one of my friends and comrades in Italy, the brilliant scholar Magda Gebremariam Tesfao, asked at this discussion that we had about citizenship at a co-op in Bologna. She said, how do we make sure that everyone gets citizenship, but also work toward a world where citizenship doesn't matter, right? Which is, like, I think, a very abolitionist understanding of struggles over citizenship.
Yeah, that's a very insightful way to frame the problem. And, it makes me think about how it can be thought relationally in connection with the tradition of abolition democracy, in the United States, where the 14th Amendment, and equal protection under the law has been such an important framework for, Black liberation, anti-imperialist, working class struggles in North America, and to the project that Du Bois talked about of abolition democracy. But it's also a contradictory terrain, right? It can risk xenophobia and nationalist issues. It's I know you've done some thinking about abolition democracy. Yeah, I wonder if you want to talk about that.
And actually, I appreciate, there's a set of things that you're reminding me of. One is, right, all of the times that Du Bois had his passport, sort of the attempts by the U.S. government to revoke Du Bois's passport because of this global solidarity work that he was doing. I'm also reminded of the labor transcending installation in downtown Detroit, which is this kind of spiral that's following essentially sort of labor struggles to win full citizenship, right? So we have citizenship rights, but also rights to leisure, the abolition of child labor, and the very last piece, as you kind of follow the dialectic spiral inward, is a Gomper's quote. And so also like having to sit with like the xenophobia of the labor movement as, right, it is also a celebration of transnational solidarity across borders. The connection between citizenship struggles and abolition is a really important one. And I think that with all of the debates about birthright citizenship in the United States, there's often a kind of forgetting that the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship is really tied to Reconstruction and the abolition of slavery, right? Guaranteeing the citizenship right of Black freedmen. And in fact, when I teach on citizenship, I always ask my students, right, what was the context of the 14th Amendment? And it's really surprising how few people really know that. And again, to think about this as to think about citizenship as an object of struggle, because I've also seen a lot of kind of naturalized comparisons, particularly kind of old world, new world comparisons. Because it is the case that there is no country in Europe that has absolute birthright citizenship like the United States, and that we tend to see birthright citizenship more commonly in the Americas and jus sanguinis citizenship more commonly in Europe. And I've seen sort of attempts to understand that actually sort of completely erase the struggle out of which birthright citizenship emerged, and it's sort of explained almost through a sort of narrative of manifest destiny, right? Well, sure, it's because it's a country of immigrants, and so therefore it's a way to sort of bring in and include immigrants. But that's not actually the case, right? The boundaries of citizenship have always been this object of struggle. And so to think about that across borders, I think is really important because, again, in this moment, as we see efforts to revoke the 14th Amendment, or at least the birthright citizenship interpretation of the 14th Amendment, there are also ongoing struggles in Italy to try and expand citizenship rights for immigrants and their children. I mean, these things are really happening simultaneously. But the question of how to understand these struggles over citizenship in the context of broader abolitionist politics is a much more challenging one. And I think ultimately it comes down to the question of whether we understand citizenship as the kind of apex of struggle, right? We sort of get full citizenship and then we've won the battle, or if it's actually just a jumping off point, something that could potentially enable other kinds of more transgressive alliances and politics and solidarities across borders.
Yeah, well, no, thanks. And I mean, it's a really helpful reframing and intervention in this moment. I also wanted to talk to you about this edited volume, The Black Geographic, which suggests the theoretical interventions that Black geography in our moment is making to confront this far-right resurgence that we've been talking about today. So can you say the interventions that you, your co-editor, and the colleagues are making in that volume? How did the Conjuncture shape what you're doing in that book?
Yeah. So the Black Geographic book emerged sort of more specifically out of a symposium that Jovan Scott Lewis and I and many other collaborators at UC Berkeley organized in the fall of 2017, actually in the midst of suffocating wildfires in Northern California. So, it was really an occasion to think about the sort of intersections of climate catastrophe, racialized spatial violence, right, and sort of all of these other kind of interlocking forms of violence that shape our moment. And more broadly, it emerged in response to shifts happening both kind of within Berkeley's geography department and in the discipline at large, which were in turn shaped by the Black Lives Matter mobilizations of the early 2010s, right? Following the murders of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland, right? And the ways that the connections, and sort of more broadly, the connections between racist spatial violence in the US and sort of this rise of the far right that was happening more broadly at that time, which we saw as fundamentally linked, right? That we can't really think about these movements against racist police terror in the United States as separate from this kind of global far right violent resurgence that, you know, was already happening in the 2010s and even earlier. And so what we're really trying to do, and by we, I mean sort of all of us who are invested in this work of Black geographies, not just Jovan and myself, was to think through the spatial dynamics of racial violence and resistance, and also to think about how to really center the critical study of racism and race within geography, but not just through, I think, what is often sort of assumed as a kind of documentation of the spatialization of racial inequality, but to really think about racism as this kind of fundamental structuring axis of power in all the ways that it articulates with capitalism and imperialism and coloniality and so on. And I think one thing that's important is to also distinguish between Black geographies, we could say maybe with a capital B and a capital G, as this sort of distinct subfield that, you know, emerged maybe in the last, say, decade or so, as a kind of consolidated and recognized subfield, which of course is always in flux and always unbounded and always unruly. And then a much longer tradition of Black spatial theorization, upon which, you know, the work, the kind of contemporary project of Black geographies is really drawing on. And one part of that longer tradition that I think is really important is, of course, the Black radical tradition, right? And the spatial analyses that we sort of gain from the Black radical tradition. And I think that what this work does is it moves us away from what in the introduction to the edited volume, Jovan and I call ontologizing claims, right? Ontologizing claims in which Blackness is rendered as singular and universal. And I think that really matters, especially in this moment. It matters for how we do politics. It matters for how we think about alliance and solidarity and co-conspiracy, right? As people from, you know, Cedric Robinson and Ruthie Gilmore remind us, right? Whether it's Cedric Robinson talking about the intertwined history of Black folk and Irish folk, or whether it's, you know, Ruthie Gilmore reminding us that racial capitalism doesn't go away if all the white people go away. Right. So it was really, you know, I think this sort of moment of increased attention and mobilization around police terror in the United States and the rise of the far right was really it sort of occasioned us to really think about how we can bring together the kind of theoretical tools of Black study, like Black studies and Black study, with the kind of spatial analyses of inequality that we get from critical human geography to really kind of make sense of the terrain of struggle. And again, the possibilities for imagining different kinds of co-conspiracy.
I really appreciate that. And, you know, in a related way, you build on the work of Clyde Woods and Catherine McKittrick's kind of groundbreaking work in Black geographies. And you know, I wanted to ask you about Clyde Woods' work, who I'll refer to as Clyde, who's a member of my dissertation committee, as you know. And, you know, it's sometimes neglected, the degree to which Clyde put a dialogue between Black geographies and, you know, what we're calling Gramscian geographies. You know, after all, Development Arrested talks about a blues block, a regional block, clearly a building on Gramsci's historical block. And I wonder if you could reflect on that dialogue, both with Woods, but between Black geographies and Gramscian geography.
Yeah. Woods is foundational, right? Clyde Woods's work is so important, and for me, his blues epistemology, which Ruthie Gilmore reminds us is also blues ontology, right, is so important, right? Even just in terms of thinking about the blues, not just as an aesthetic practice, but also as a mode of theorizing, right? The blues as a way of critiquing or diagnosing plantation power, but then also sort of enacting or prefiguring, imagining other modes of kind of more just development. And what I love about the blues epistemology is that it is a very Gramscian understanding of cultural politics as well, right? In which we see that a kind of cultural analysis and a rigorous political economy actually need to go hand in hand. And I think it's also a really Gramscian understanding of intellectuals and the work of philosophy as activities that are not necessarily linked to like a specific professional class, right? Like I think Woods' Clyde, if I may, is also giving us a real example of that in a way that we could read alongside Gramsci's writing on intellectuals and the praxis of philosophy. Another part of his work that actually is really important to me is the essay that he wrote in the Professional Geographer called Life After Death. Yeah, in which I think he asked some very damning questions about the ways that race was taken up in geography. And he asked this question, he says, are we little more than just academic coroners who kind of arrive after the scene with our rusty tools, basically, trying to write death certificates when we don't actually, he says, we even know the patient is dead.
The autopsy is premature.
Exactly, which is like horrific, right? That's like, actually, when you really think about it, like that is a horrific and like damning condemnation of geography, right? So much work, I think, on race and space has been about naming all the ways that racial violence gets enacted spatially. And I don't want to deny the importance of those interventions. Like, that's really important. And at the same time, I think he's occasioning us to ask, like, what's the broader project here? Like, in what service are we sort of identifying all of the different ways that racial violence gets enacted spatially? And so with that, I also am thinking alongside Catherine McKittrick and her, her questions about the ways that often in attempts to name racial violence, we end up narratively reproducing it, right? Where Black communities are only ever dead or dying or diseased or polluted or dispossessed. And that's not to say that the solution is like a Pollyanna-ish appeal to, optimism and resistance, but it is, it asks, I think, really important questions of how we find lines of flight out of what she calls these loops, where Black and other dispossessed communities only become legible to our disciplines through their abjection, right?
Yeah. She, by which I mean Catherine McKittrick and Clyde, argued persuasively that we instead need to think about Black communities as integral to the production of space and therefore of possible futures, of the remaking of geographies, not simply as passive victims. Well, Camilla, I could talk to you all day. It's been really nice to speak with you. But is there anything I haven't asked that you'd like to add?
I think this was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really grateful that we got the chance to do this. And I also want to thank our viewers and listeners for joining us for this episode of Conjuncture. Stay tuned.